Life is full of choices. Some are relatively simple. Should we get Dad a tool or a tie? Should we try the floss dance or the shoot? Should we root for Superman or some inferior superhero? But sooner or later, part of life is that we will each be faced with more difficult decisions. Decisions that are not easily made, and while some of us are able to make even difficult decisions quickly, we may not be right, but at least we're sure. Others of us take a little more time. We toss and turn. We make pro and con lists. We wear out our magic 8 balls. Reply hazy. But that doesn't change the fact that eventually we have to make a decision. After all, even a decision not made is in and of itself a decision. The challenge, of course, is that we know from experience that our decisions have consequences. They affect not just us, but the world around us, for better or worse. Which is why, as a people of faith, we long to make the best decisions possible. The challenge, of course, is that we won't. Not always. The good news is that, as we heard in our scripture lesson for today, the God who gave us choice has promised to stand with us regardless of the decisions we make, good, bad, or ugly. And let's face it, we will all make some of each, maybe even today. Decisions, after all, are hard. And part of being human is wrestling with the decisions we make. And so today we go back to the beginning. Not the very, very beginning. It is a good place to start, but a part of the beginning, close to it. On this Father's Day, we go back to the origin of the decision itself. We start very close to the beginning and the second story of creation from chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis. Now, some will remember the first story of creation. It was the poetic one. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and called them good, and the rest of the week went about the same way, with God creating light and dark, dry land and sea, plants, vegetation, creatures, mosquitoes, and eventually, as the pièce de résistance, us. Human beings, male and female, God created them in God's image. Let's just repeat that. Male and female in God's image, both in God's image, equal. We're clear on that part, right? It's a beautiful part of the story. It's that reminder right there, smack dab at the beginning of our scripture, of what we will go on to read throughout. That we are all intimately connected with God, and that we are fundamentally good. Maybe some of us needed just that reminder this morning. But today we're focusing on the second story of creation. It's not as poetic, sequels rarely are, but it's just as important for our faith. You may recognize it. It begins with a man set in a garden, a man being formed out of the dust in a garden, right? And called Adam, which means from the dust. Not particularly creative, but it was the most popular name that year. We know that piece of the story, don't we? But then it goes on. Man is formed first in this story, and then we get the animals, and then woman. Do you see? Different order, different names for God, different story. Now, for some, this comes as a shock. They can go to church their entire lives and not realize that there are actually multiple stories of creation. Just FYI, there's another one in the Gospel of John much later. And we're faced with a choice when we hear it. We rationally minded, generally skeptical people have really two choices when we hear this. We think we have two choices at least. We think, well, there's two stories of creation. We either have to reconcile the two or throw the whole thing out, figuring if they can't get the beginning right, why read to the end? But to do so, friends, would miss the point. You see, these stories weren't told to be taken literally. These stories were not there as histories of our faith. They're there to tell us something of who we are. And the ancient Hebrew people who first told these stories orally and then, thank God, took the time to write them down, wanted us to get something out of them. They weren't dumb. They knew that they were two different stories with two different orders of creation, but they thought both had something to say, that neither one told the whole truth, but that together they got closer towards it. We would be wise to keep reading. The past 200 years, we have pitted science and religion against each other. We've forced ourselves to come down on one side or the other, and we have lost generations of people of faith because of it. Don't you see we're missing the point? Science, evolution, helps us understand the how of how we got here. But faith helps us understand the why of why we are here. Both are important, and a story doesn't have to have happened for it to be true. In the end, the real choice we're faced with is the same one we're faced with each day. Will we listen for the truth or not? Will we take the time to unpack these beautiful stories, these founding myths of our faith, listening for how God is speaking to us, or will we throw the baby out with the bathwater? How about today, we try the first. Just for today, let's listen for how God might be speaking to us in this story, trusting that where there is truth, there is God. So Adam is formed of the dust, and he's set in a beautiful garden, and he's given one command. God says to him, "You may eat of any tree, but do not eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil." Great name for a tree. "For on that day you will die." Now, hopefully, God was really clear about which tree that was. Without written language, it would be hard to label. Then again, maybe it was like the dogwood tree, which you can tell by its bark. You're welcome. He's set in the garden and he's going along just fine, but then God notices that he's a little lonely, and that first thing that God says is not good is said there in that moment. It is not good that someone be alone. The first thing in the entire Bible that God says is not good is forced loneliness. We may consider this as the church wrestles to include our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. Forced loneliness is not good. And so God says, "I will make you a companion." And in this story, that's when the animals come. They are all formed out of the dust. They're all formed there, but then there's still something lacking, and so God creates woman. It's a strange little story about a rib, but God creates woman. We're unfortunately given the translation helper, but the truth is it's a companion on equal level, or perhaps even greater level. The only other time that particular word is used, it is used to refer to God in our scripture, which is anything but lesser. We got that part down, right? And so woman is formed. We've got that part. Now comes the scandalous part, the part that's been used throughout the centuries, which is, of course, the moment when the woman is tricked by Satan, when she seduces the man, which leads to the downfall of the entire society, or at least that's the way we've told the story. That's how Timothy tells it in the New Testament, and that's a great story, save for the fact that it's not actually the story. Look at the story. In our story, we have a serpent. A talkative serpent, mind you, but a serpent nonetheless. Not the devil, not Satan, just your run-of-the-mill talking serpent who happens to be craftier than all other animals and who begins in that moment to ask some hard questions. The serpent says to the woman, later to be named Eve, he says to her, "Did God tell you not to eat of any tree in the garden?" And the woman says, we may eat of any tree in the garden, but God said to us, you shall not eat of the tree in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, for on that day you shall die. Now that's not quite what God said. God didn't say the middle of the garden, nor that they shouldn't touch it, but point taken. We should also point out that the command that God did give was in the singular, referring especially to Adam and not to Eve. It was singular. In other words, she wasn't told not to eat, which seems perhaps a technicality, but important given the fact that for 2,000 years we have used this to blame women for the downfall of society. But the serpent says, you will not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will become like God, able to see good and evil. And in that moment, we have the first choice of Scripture. The very first choice, should she eat or should she not? God told them on the one hand to be fruitful, not fruitless, and on the other, God warned them not to eat. And she has a choice to make. Now, setting aside the fact that we know how the story goes, and in fact, the serpent is right. When they eat, they do not die. But it's still a choice to be made. Should she eat or should she not? Maybe we've been faced with a choice recently. Maybe we're faced with a choice right now. And we have all of these tools that we use at our disposal. First, of course, our brains. Not enough people use those. We ought to start with our reason, right? There's something about reason that can help us, but the truth is, reason only gets us so far. And reason without anything else, without a little heart, without a little feeling, without being tempered by experience, can lead to pain. We've seen it in our world. Look at the border right now. It's reasonable to want to have a secure border, until we start to see nursing children ripped from their mothers. People of faith, we are not called always to be reasonable. We're called to do some pretty unreasonable things, like forgiving each other, like loving our enemies, like standing in the face of death and proclaiming life. These are not reasonable things, and yet the unreasonable is sometimes right. So the woman could have used her reason. Maybe we ought to do the same. But it wasn't quite enough. Now, she could have prayed, but prayer had yet to be invented. She didn't have scripture or tradition. Those things weren't there, though they could help us, which left her with few other options save one. She did have, of course, another tool in her toolbox, a tool that we have in our toolbox but too often ignored. Ignore, Google, just kidding. Each other. The truth is, we're called to make decisions in a community because our decisions affect the community. That's part of why we're in a church. As imperfect as we are, we recognize that we're more perfect together than we are apart. And so we gather together to make decisions, to try our best, to figure out, to fumble our way forward. She had a community of exactly one, who we learn from reading the story was standing next to her the whole time, was right there. He could have said anything at any point, but instead just remained there silently. We blame her. He was the one who was told not to eat. And he could have told at any point, well, maybe I feel a little weird about this. We were told. No, none of that. Instead, he just stands there silently and as a result, fails. But she failed as well, right? She failed to reach out to discern what was going on within community. That's what community is for. It's no coincidence that the very first act of disobedience in Scripture is a failure of community. That's what sin looks like. A failure to live in community with one another. We do it all the time, don't we? The opioid epidemic, the systemic racism, the environmental crisis, all of the things that we look around in our world and see, they are failures of community. And it's so easy when faced with all of these big problems to throw up our hands and to think, well, there's nothing I can do. What good could I possibly do? But that's where the failure happens. When we refuse to do our part. We can take a step towards another person, but it takes a choice, and choices are hard. But the good news is we have Scripture and tradition and reason and experience to back us up, but more importantly than any of those, we have each other. We have a commitment we just made in baptism to walk alongside, to stand with one another, and to figure out how to make this world better. But it takes a choice. Some of us were lucky enough to have fathers in our lives who helped us make those difficult decisions, and some of us did not. But the good news is that all of us have someone. We may not know it, but we do. That's what it means to be a part of a church. We're here because somewhere in that primordial part of our soul, we recognize that we can't do this alone. That was true in the beginning, and it's true now. The story ends when the woman takes a bite of the fruit, and the man eats of the fruit, and their eyes are opened. They recognize that they're naked and immediately try to cover themselves up. They hide from God and from each other. And when that happens, as we know from hard experience, we may not die, but life becomes really difficult. Now, maybe that was the lesson those ancient scribes wanted us to hear. And maybe not. What we take from any story is our choice. The good news is that life is full of choices. Thanks be to God. Amen.